Hi, everybody. Welcome to, once again, our Friday question of the week, where I come in here on Facebook and on YouTube, and I answer questions that I have from my kids that I've worked with during the week. Yes, school is back for some schools already. I tutor kids all across the United States, and while here in Oregon, school is just getting started for some kids are still on summer vacation. I have kids in the South and on the East Coast that have already been going to school for a while. And so today's edition is geometry. So the question I've had most often this week is about finding midpoints. So let's go to the whiteboard and look at those midpoint questions. I'm going to share my screen here with you. If I can do this correctly. Let's see, here we are. And I'm going to see if I can make, let's see, I'm going to make myself just a little bit bigger here. And I don't know, I don't think I'm going to use this bottom part. So there I am at the bottom. And by the way, I do tutor math. Obviously, I've been tutoring. And if you are interested in getting your son or daughter up and running with any of the high school curriculum, I'd love to help. Just DM me and send me a message, or go to my website at www.tagtutoring.com, and you can send me a message over there, find out more information about me, and let me know. And my schedule's starting to fill up, but I still have room, so let me know. And by the way, if you don't know this about me, I've been a classroom teacher for over 30 years, and now I have my own tutoring business. Where I tutor online like this, and you'll get to see right now how I teach a little bit of geometry. Geometry is one of my favorites. It's really interesting because when I was in high school, I did horrible in geometry, and I was a really good math student. It was because my math teacher was horrible. I think the world's worst geometry teacher, who was just awful. He was the worst math teacher I ever had. And that's a lot saying. I mean, I couldn't understand geometry at all, and I understood math. So sometimes when your son or daughter's struggling, it's not because of them, it's because of the teacher. There, I said it. So let's take a look. And I want to start with a number line, because that's probably where your son or daughter is going to start. Let's make sure that I have everything working here for me correctly. There we go. So let's start with a number line, and let's say, well, let's start out here. Say I have a point here at A at 2, and I have another point here at B. And so we would be talking about the segment AB, and you would put a segment over the top, and you put a segment over the top to let the person know that you're talking about a segment, not a line. If you're talking about the line, you'd put arrows on the end. Okay, so let's say I want the midpoint of that segment, AB. So a number line, there's ways to do this without using any formula at all. And lots of kids do it that way. And you can do it this way. You could just start by going, okay, well, if I go 1 in from A and 1 in from 5, I'm keeping it equal distant, right? Okay, so now if I go 1 in from 3, 1 in from 5, well, I've landed right there at 4. So the midpoint of AB must be 4. And sure enough, that in fact is the midpoint. And you know what? On a number line, I don't see any reason not to do that. That's totally fine. You can find the midpoint that way. But a midpoint is just the middle of a segment. So a midpoint, I'm going to get official here. A midpoint, this is the technical definition, cuts a segment. Let me get official. Cuts a segment into 2 congruent segments. Now, most kids think, oh, it's the middle. Yes, it is the middle, but let's think about this in terms of that definition. It cuts it into 2 equal segments. So let me change colors here for just a second. I have all these colors I can use. Let's think about the segment from AM. How long is that segment? Well, when I counted in from the center from A, didn't I go 2 spaces? That's 2, right? And when I went in from B to M, it was 2 segments. So I created 2 equal segments. When you place the midpoint, you've created 2 equal segments. And if it's not equal, you're not really at the middle. You're not at the midpoint, right? Okay, so I'm going to choose another way to do this midpoint just to show you another way to attack this problem. And that is, you could look at the 2 coordinates. So A is at 2 and B is at 6, right? If M is truly at the middle, isn't it kind of like an average? Like, couldn't I take the 2 coordinates, 2 and 6, add them up and divide by 2, because that's how you'd find an average. Let's see if I'd get to the same spot. So I'm taking 2 plus 6 and dividing it by 2 because it's halfway in the middle. So 2 plus 6 is 8, cut it in half, and I get 4. So that's where I think the midpoint is. Well, look at that. Holy cow. That is the midpoint. So it turns out you can just find the average and you're going to find the midpoint. That's how you find the midpoint if you don't want to just look at the number line. So let's try this again. I'm going to use different coordinates and see if it works. This is actually how I do it, so I don't have to count. So let's say I'm at, now I'll use different letters. Let's say I'm at T at -6 and I'm at -1, we'll call it G. Why am I picking T and G? Because my name's Terry Grigsby, and I always like to use my initials or somebody's initials when I do this. I know, I'm silly that way. So T is at -6 and G is at -1. So I'm going to use my same method. I'm going to just average them, okay? So I'm going to go -6 plus -1. I'm going to cut them in half because that's how you find averages. Plus, if it's a midpoint, you want halfway in the middle, right? Okay, so -6 plus 1 gives me -7. Going to cut it in half. You can use a calculator, but I'm going to use my noggin here. And I'm going to get -3.5. That's where I think the midpoint is of T and G. So let me see, use a different color. I'll use yellow. So I'm going to plot -3.5 and I'm going to see -3.5 would be right here. Now, does that look like it's in the middle of T and G? Yeah, looks like I got it right. And the nice thing about my method is, if I, instead of trying to jump to the center like I did originally, is I don't have to think about it. All I have to do is calculate it, add those 2 suckers up and cut them in half, and boom, there I am at the midpoint. It's really kind of a genius way of doing it. So on a number line, add up the 2 coordinates and cut them in half. You'll always get to the midpoint. That's my method, and I'm sticking to it, guys. Okay, that's if it's a number line, but it's not always going to be on a number line because we're in geometry class. We can do things more than one way. So let's take a look if we're on a coordinate system. So here we go. And here we have the midpoint theorem. You guys, this isn't even shocking if you know what I just did on my last problem where I averaged the 2 coordinates. I'm going to go back to blue here, where I added up the numbers and cut them in half. Well, now we have 2 coordinates, X and Y, right? So let's call this point A and this point B now, okay? So I am going to find the coordinates of A. So A looks to me to be at -5. Well, -5, right? And B looks to be at -1, -1. Well, that was nice of them. So I'm going to write that over here. A is at -5, -5. And B is at -1, -1. So like, don't freak out that there's 2 coordinates, X and Y, and that formula looks big and scary. Do not worry. It's just like the number line. It's just you're going to have to do X's and Y's now. Okay, so knowing that that's the case here, I'm going to change my color here just to do it differently. So I'm going to do my X's. So remember, every ordered pair, the X is first and the Y second, right? I'm going to change that color for the Y's to match the formula. Okay. I'm going to be all color coordinated for you people. Yes, I am. So it's going to be X and Y. So I'm going to do my X's first. So I'm going to go so notice how it says X1 and X2. It doesn't matter which one you put first because you're just adding them up anyway. So do it however you want to do it. So I'm going to choose to go -5 plus -1, and then I'm going to cut it in half. Okay, those are my two X's, right? And then I'm going to keep it in an ordered pair, I think, because I just want to keep it the same as the midpoint theorem. So I'm going to keep it as an ordered pair here. And then this will come out to be my midpoint, okay? And now I'm going to do my Y's. Well, my Y's were, my two coordinates of my Y's were -5 plus -1 divided by 2. In this case, they happen to be the same because the coordinates were coming out the same, right? Okay, so my X's, -5 plus -1 is -6 divided by 2. That gives me -3, right? And then let me do the oranges. Let me do my Y's. So -5 plus -1 gives me -6 over 2 again. And that gives me -3. And so I know I'm changing colors a lot here, but I'm trying to keep it color coordinated for you. So I think my midpoint here is at -3, -3. So notice that just like on the number line, I did it exactly the same way. I just averaged them because the midpoint should be in the middle. So you're averaging the X's, you're averaging the Y's. So let's see if that works. So I'm going to go to -3, -3, check it out. My midpoint is exactly in the middle. And I highly recommend after you calculate your midpoint, look on the graph and see if it comes out in the middle. And it should every time. Okay, so you're just finding averages for the X and the Y. The theorem looks scary, but it's just adding them up and dividing by 2. Okay, let's try another one. This time I'm going to just stick to one color here. I'm just going to stick to blue. I'm feeling blue today, guys. So this time I'm going to choose O and G because my dog's name is Oliver Grigsby. Telling you I use initials a lot. So I'm at -5 for O, and G is at 2, -5. Okay, so I'm going to take my X's. My X's are -5 plus 2, and I'm going to cut them in half, right? And my Y's are 5 plus -5 and cut them in half. Take a second after you do that and just make sure that I put my X's here and my Y's here, because that's the most common place that people mess it up. Let's see, -5 and 2 are my X's, 5 and -5 are my Y's. So I think I did it right. And I'll know once I plot the point. So, okay, let's go. So -5 plus 2 is -3 over 2. -5 plus, or 5 plus -5 is 0 over 2. So when I graph, when I'm dealing with a graph, I like to go to a decimal or at least a fraction, a mixed number. So that would be -1.5, and that would be 0. I think that's my midpoint. So let's see how I did. -1.5, 0. Oh yeah, baby, look at that. I'm right in the middle. OMG, OMG. That was a happy circumstance. I got it right. OMG, I'm correct. By the way, Oliver's middle name is not M, does not begin with an M, but that's okay. So it works, just averaging the X's and Y's. It looks scary, but it's not that scary. Okay, so this is one where they don't graph it, but you don't need the graph now because you know what's happening. So X's go together. What are my X's? -1 plus -6. We're going to cut it in half. My y's are -6 and 5. Going to cut it in half, but I'm going to take a second, make sure these are my x's and these are my y's. I always do that. -1, -6 are my x's, -6 and 5 are my y's. Okay, I'm good to go. So I'm going to get -7/2 and -1/2. And that's going to give me -3.5 and -0.5. And I'm going to live like a champion. And I think that's my midpoint. You could, of course, if this is a test or a quiz you guys are taking, you can always do a little sketch and make sure that that's really the midpoint. But I'm going to go with that because I think that's right. Okay, so you don't have to graph it to do it. Let's keep going because I have a different kind right here. I want to make sure I go over it with you on this Friday question of the week. This is different. This time they're saying, look, I'm going to give you one endpoint and the midpoint. I want you to find the other one, the other endpoint. So this is, I'm going to just give you like a major sketch that is not correct, but I'll give it to you with at least a straight line. So something's happening here where they're giving me an endpoint here at 5, 2. And then they're telling me, here's the midpoint at -10, -2. And they want me to find the other endpoint at, and I'll just call it XY because I don't have any idea what it is. Now, there are lots of ways you can calculate that. And the person actually that I worked with this week had the system to figure it out that was completely different than what I just showed you. But here's my theory. There's so much to learn in math that I like to just have one method that I have to know, and then I do it on all the kinds of problems that relate to it. So I'm going to stick to my midpoint theorem because it works for everything, and including this. So if I'm doing my midpoint theorem, and I have it set up like this picture, well, wouldn't you find the midpoint? So it would go, the midpoint theorem goes, I'll just write it out. Doesn't it go x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then y1 plus y2 and divided by 2? Now, if I know that, and I've been using it this whole question, right, of this little video, I'm going to plug in what I know. Well, don't I know the midpoint? I know my midpoint's -10, -2, because they told me, right? So I'm going to plug it in. So I plugged it in. Now, on the midpoint's coordinates, I know one of the endpoints, the other one is xy. Well, so I'm going to plug that in. So I don't know the first one, I'm going to call it x, but I know the other x coordinate's 5, right? Going to cut it in half. The y coordinates, I don't know one of them, so I'm going to call it y like I did in my picture, and the other y coordinate is 2, right? So I'm going to plug it in. So basically on the right-hand side, I just plugged in the xy and I plugged in the 5, 2. And in the equation, I plugged in the midpoint. So I'm using the same formula, so I don't have to remember a different way of doing this problem. I'm just plugging in what I know. So now, for this to work, if this equation's really true, wouldn't it have to be true that -10, the x coordinate right here, would have to match the x coordinate right there? It would have to be true, right? So -10 would have to equal x plus 5 over 2. It has to, or the coordinates wouldn't be the same. Well, you just came from an algebra class last school year, so we can solve this. So I would like to get rid of the fraction. I think I would multiply both sides by 2. I'm going to multiply this by 2. So that would give me -20 equals, well, that would cancel with that, x plus 5. And then to solve that, I would just subtract 5, right? And so that would give me that x is -25. So that was easy to solve. So I know over my picture over here that this x is -25 now. I just got the x coordinate for that other endpoint. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing on the other point. So if I know y here is -2, well, it's got to match that y coordinate, right? So now I know -2 has to equal y plus 2 over 2, right? Now it's just algebra. You're going to find this in geometry all the time. You start by using the geometry, you finish it by doing algebra. Okay, so it's the same algebra. You're going to multiply by 2 to both sides. So that's going to give me -4. Then the 2's will cancel, equals y plus 2. Subtract the 2 off. And I'm going to get y equals -6. So I just figured out my y coordinate is -6. And boom, just like that, I have the other endpoint. And I used the exact same formula I had before. Now, I had to do a little more work because I had to know, okay, I'm going to use the midpoint theorem like I used before, but I just had to plug everything in. That's the only difference, right? I think I have one more here just to let us practice now that you see what the problem is and how we do it. I'm going to do one more for you. So it's the same idea. Let me go ahead and do it again. I'm not going to take quite as much time to do it, but I am going to do the picture because I always think the picture just helps me see what's going on here. Let me turn the line off. So I know one endpoint here is at -1, 9. I know the midpoint is at -9, -10, and I don't know the other endpoint, so I'm always going to call it XY. And it doesn't even matter, you know, that you get the orientation right. Just make sure the midpoint's in the middle, right? Okay, so the midpoint has to equal x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Plus, doing these problems, you learn the theorem, right? If you write it every time, you're always going to learn the formula. Okay, so my midpoint is -9, -10, right? I'm plugging in. My x's are x, and then my other x is -1. I'm going to cut it in half. My y's are y, and my other y is 9, and I'm going to cut that in half. Okay, so my x on my midpoint's -9, and it's got to match my x coordinate over here. So -9 has got to equal x plus -1, cutting it in half. So to solve it, you're going to multiply by 2. So that gives me -18. Cancel out the 2's. You'll get x plus -1, add 1. And so x will be -17. That gives me the x coordinate here will be -17. Okay, so now let's go get the y. We're going to go get the y, people. So here's the y coordinate, and it's got to match the y coordinate over here. So -10 has to equal y plus 9 over 2. So, okay, multiply by 2. So -20 equals 2's cancel, y plus 9 minus 9. So y equals -29. Ooh, my 9's are trying to be 4's. Okay, so my y coordinate is -29. Oh my goodness, you guys. I am so human, it scares me sometimes. -29. And that's going to be the other endpoint. That's the answer they're looking for. So you can see once you get it set up in the theorem from geometry, it's all algebra after that. So if you're good at algebra, then you're going to be good at geometry once you get it set up. All right, so that's it, guys. That's how you do the midpoint problems. And if you, with a little bit of practice, you can do them too, and it's going to be no problem on the midpoint theorems. Again, thanks for watching this problem. I don't always do geometry questions on my Fridays because I tutor Algebra 1, Algebra 2. I do a lot of AGS, and if you're in the Beaverton or other areas locally to mine, I also do trigonometry and pre-calculus. So look me up, look at my Facebook account, go to my website, tagtutoring.com, and check out my videos on my YouTube channel with the same name. So thanks for tuning in. I'll be back again next Friday with a different question of the week. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye-bye.